Hello, welcome to lesson 8.3B. I've entitled this video, We Are Not Enemies, but Friends. This video is going to cover pages 503 to 507. Causes leading to war. Now, a new issue emerged. Did the Constitution allow states to secede? Most white Southerners believed that they had the right to secede. After all, the Declaration of Independence said that, quote, "It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish a government that denies the rights of its citizens." Lincoln, they believed, would deny them the right to force African Americans to live and work as slaves. Question number 1. Why did many Southerners believe they had the right to secede from the United States? They believed that because in the Declaration of Independence it said it is the right of people to alter or abolish a government that denies the rights that they seek. So in this case, they felt like Lincoln in the North was going to deny them the rights of slavery. For many Southerners, secession was an issue of states' rights. According to this view, the Constitution created a union comprised of sovereign states, and each state had the authority to make decisions without interference from the federal government. Any state could decide to leave the Union at any point and to join with others to form a new government, such as the Confederacy. For this one, question 2, why did Southerners view secession as an issue of states' rights? They believed that states had the right to do this, to secede and form their own country. I would argue, successfully argue, the case that, according to the Constitution, that's not the case. Article 6 of the Constitution is called the Supremacy Clause, and it says, state governments may not make any law or take any action that conflicts with the U.S. Constitution or national laws. So it's in our Constitution. It's not legal. You can't do it. And yet the South used the Declaration of Independence, which is an important document, but we're not governed by the Declaration of Independence. We're governed by the Constitution, and they were doing something that was unconstitutional. Lincoln disagreed, as does Mr. Morris. He maintained that the Constitution shared powers between national and state governments, but did not give states a sovereignty that would allow them to secede. He's right. The causes of the looming Civil War thus included sectionalism, disagreement over slavery, and disagreement over the constitutionality of states' rights. So for question number 3, why did President Lincoln disagree with the South's point of view over secession? He said, hey, look, the Constitution says, yeah, we do have powers that are shared between the national and state governments, but states do not have the power to secede. That is not allowable according to our Constitution. The outbreak of war. When Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, he faced a dangerous situation. 7 southern states had seceded from the United States and had joined together to form the Confederacy. Lincoln's first inaugural address. When he took office, Lincoln delivered an inaugural address. In the speech, Lincoln warned that, quote, no state can lawfully get out of the Union. Still, he pledged that there would be no war unless the South started it. Primary source, Abraham Lincoln, first inaugural address, March 4, 1861. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. Lincoln's first inaugural address expressed ideas about union, liberty, equality, and government. Regarding union, Lincoln emphasized that the Constitution set limits on the action of states, and there was no provision in the Constitution for secession. That is, the Constitution required that the Union be preserved. On liberty, again, Lincoln emphasized that the states' liberty was constrained by their acceptance of the Constitution and did not include a right to secede. Lincoln also stated his willingness to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, but only if the liberty of free African Americans from kidnapping and enslavement could be ensured. Regarding equality, Lincoln assured Americans that he would provide government services and enforce federal law equally in all states, whether they were slave or free states. Finally, Lincoln stated that government required acquiescence or the willingness to accept laws whether or not a person agreed with those laws. The unwillingness of the South to accept his legal election under the Constitution, he implied, was a threat to government. So we have a lot there for question 4. What were some of the main points that President Lincoln made in his inaugural address? He made a lot of points. He talked about union. He talked about liberty. He talked about equality. He talked about that the Constitution did have limits and states were not allowed to secede. He also said, hey, I'll enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, but only if you can promise me that free African Americans won't be kidnapped any longer and enslaved. Also, he said, listen, I will give government services and enforce the law equally in states that are both free and slave. And finally, Lincoln said, listen, we have to accept laws whether we like them or not. That's how government works. You may not always agree with laws. Well, then have future elections, have people change those laws. But just saying I quit and folding your arms and crying like a little baby because you don't like a way a certain law went is not the way our Constitution was written. Jefferson Davis's inaugural address. By the time Lincoln gave his address, the Confederate States of America had already sworn in Jefferson Davis as president. Davis's inaugural speech was very different from Lincoln's. Whereas Lincoln pledged to keep the Union together, Davis explained why the South had decided to secede from the Union. Davis said secession was based on, quote, the desire to preserve our own rights and promote our own welfare. Davis also said, quote, it is joyous in the midst of perilous times to look around upon a people united in heart, where one purpose of high resolve animates and actuates the whole, where the sacrifices to be made are not weighed in the balance against honor and right and liberty and equality. For Davis, liberty and equality existed only between white men. Lincoln, in contrast, believed secession countered the principles of liberty and equality on which the nation was founded and its government was based. In a later speech, Lincoln would extend the idea of equality to all Americans, as it should have been. Question number 5. What were some of the differences between Lincoln's inaugural address and Davis's inaugural address? Well, where Lincoln had basically talked about keeping the country together, Davis talked about why the country needed to secede and break apart. Also, according to Jefferson Davis, liberty and equality were only existent between white men. Lincoln, on the opposite spectrum, said that we should have equality and liberty for all people in America. Davis emphasized that government exists only with the consent of the governed. Since Southerners no longer consented to this government, they had to break away and form a government to which they could consent. This was in contrast to Lincoln's argument that government sometimes requires citizens to acquiesce to or obey laws with which they disagree. He described secession as, quote, the essence of anarchy. Davis also argued that each state had the right to reclaim powers that it had given the federal government. Lincoln disagreed. He argued that the Constitution was an agreement among all the states and that no state could leave the Union without the agreement of the others. He is right. So, finishing question 5, here we see another contrast. Davis said that states could break away and form a government in which they consented to, and Lincoln said, no, that's not how it works. Sometimes there are going to be laws you don't like. That's the way government works. Try to do better in the next election. Try to come up with better laws in the future, but breaking away is not an answer. Davis also said that states had the right to reclaim powers from the federal government. Lincoln said, no, that's not how it works. The Constitution is an agreement among all the states, and no one state can just say, I'm out of here. That's not how our Constitution was written. Lincoln faces war. Lincoln said in his inaugural address that he did not want war, but Jefferson Davis had already ordered Confederate forces to begin seizing federal forts in the South. Lincoln faced a difficult decision. Should he let the Confederates take over federal property? If he did, he would seem to be admitting that states had the right to secede. Yet, if he sent troops to hold the forts, he might start a civil war and lose the support of the 8 slave states that had not yet seceded. And that's a very important thing to remember. There were still these border states, these states in the middle that had slavery but had not yet left. Lincoln did not want to do anything to force them to leave. In April, the Confederacy forced Lincoln's hand. By then, Confederate troops controlled nearly all forts, post offices, and other federal buildings in the South. The Union held only 3 forts off the Florida coast and Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Fort Sumter was important to the Confederacy because it guarded Charleston Harbor. Question number 6. When the Confederate forces began seizing federal forts in the South, what difficult decision did Lincoln face? Well, one, if he let them take over the forts, he was saying that states could secede and they had the right to do that. However, on the flip side, if he sent troops down to take back the forts, he might start a civil war and he might lose the support of the 8 slave states that were still in the country. Oh my, what a dilemma for Lincoln. Confederate troops attacked Fort Sumter. President Lincoln learned that food supplies at Fort Sumter were running low. He notified the governor of South Carolina that he was going to ship food to the fort. Lincoln promised not to send troops or weapons. The Confederates refused to allow any shipments to the fort. On April 11, 1861, they demanded that Fort Sumter surrender. Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander, refused to give in, and Confederate guns opened fire. The Union troops quickly ran out of ammunition. On April 13th, Anderson surrendered the fort. The bombardment marked the start of the Civil War, which would last 4 terrible years, from 1861 to 1865. Question number 7. When Lincoln said to the governor, "I'm only going to send what?" He said, "I'm only going to send food. I'm not going to send troops. I'm not going to send weapons." Question 8. What happened at Fort Sumter in April of 1861? The Confederates attacked, took the fort, and thus began the Civil War, the bloodiest war in American history. Question 9. How long did the Civil War last? 4 years, from 1861 to 1865. How did Americans take sides? When the war began, each side was convinced that its cause was just. Southerners believed states had the right to leave the Union. In fact, they called the conflict the War for Southern Independence. White Southerners wanted independence so that they could keep their traditional way of life, including, of course, the institution of slavery. They also believed the North had caused the war. Many Southerners, therefore, also called it the War of Northern Aggression. Question number 10. Southerners have called the Civil War by many other names. What are 2 other names? Number 1, the War for Southern Independence, and 2, the War of Northern Aggression. There's also a lot of other names for the Civil War that I have over here. Question number 11. What was the main reason the South fought the Civil War? Well, it's in the names that they called the war. They believed they had the right to be independent and free from Northern rule. They wanted to have the right of slavery. Northerners believed that they were fighting to save the Union. Abolishing slavery was not an official goal. Let me say that again. Abolishing slavery was not an official goal. In fact, many Northerners, guided by feelings of racism, approved of slavery. Racism is the belief that one race is by nature superior to another. In fact, if we look at this quote from Abraham Lincoln, it shows you how Lincoln was feeling even in 1862, a year into the war. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modifications of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. So even there, Lincoln was saying, listen, the goal of this war is not to end slavery. The goal of this war is to bring the country back together again, to save the country. Now, he would change that view as the war went on, but at the start, that was not an official goal of the war, to abolish slavery. Question number 12. The main reason the North began fighting the Civil War? To save the country, to save the Union. Number 13. What was not an official goal of the war? To abolish slavery. Number 14. What is racism? Racism is the belief that one race is by nature superior to another. In April 1861, 8 slave states had not yet decided whether to remain in the Union. These states had more than half of the South's population and food crops and many of the South's factories. They would be important assets to whichever side they joined. 4 of these states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, quickly joined the Confederacy. After some indecision, each of the 4 border states, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, decided to remain in the Union. So question number 15, which 4 border states joined the Confederacy? Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Question 16, which 4 border states remained in the Union? That would be Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. Question number 17, why were the border states important for both sides? Well, they had more than half of the South's population, they had lots of food, and many of the South's factories. So whoever could keep those border states would have a lot of factories, a lot of food, and a lot of people. Well, thank you very much for watching. Before we go, I have a joke for you. Which president is the least guilty? The answer, Lincoln. Why? He is innocent. Oh my. Have a good day.